Well, Dale, we're so excited to have you here with us at the University of Mary. You're doing the late show tonight with Father Bauk, and that's quite a crowd. That'll be a real treat for our students. And you're visiting your son and your daughter here on campus. And you're someone who spent most of your adult life studying Chesterton. One of your books is entitled The Apostle of Common Sense. What is common sense for Chesterton?
That's a great question. What is common sense? Why is that even a question? Most people know what common sense is, and yet now we're at the point in our societal evolution we have to explain what common sense is. It's the ideas that everyone knows to be true. They immediately recognize them to be true when they hear about them, but they seem to be avoiding them in our society today. It's the very sense that people avoid, the things that were once common to all people that are now uncommon.
There seems to be kind of optimism in human nature there that some of these things are innate in us and can't be overwritten. Do you think Chesterton shares that view?
I think so. I mean, if you think about it, justice is innate in our system, right? Everyone understands when justice has been violated, even when they're a child. And children understand a certain morality that they've learned in the nursery, as Chesterton argues. And those truths stay with us for a long time, even when we lose our way. We still have a recollection of basic truths, good morals that we know when we're violating.
I think about, we're here at the University of Mary University, and I think about the relationship between education and common sense, right? And I think we often think that our goal as educators is to improve upon common sense, or at least not eradicate it in any particular way. And yet Chesterton says that one of the most important roles of an education is to awaken the imagination, or to enliven it. Why does he say that, and what's the relationship between common sense and imagination?
Well, Chesterton defines education as truth in the state of transmission, simply passing the truth from one generation to the next. That's what we do when we educate. And the way we convey the truth is we have to find a new way to do it all the time. And that's where the imagination kicks in. The imagination is used to make the word into flesh. It's our creative act. Chesterton says that imagination is one of the most godlike qualities we have. Just like God is a creator, so are we creators. Imagination is often making something out of nothing, and that's what God did when he created us. And so the active imagination is always this artistic, creative act.
How does that apply to other disciplines besides just sort of the explicitly creative discipline?
Well, it certainly, I think, applies to just about any discipline there is. There are certain things when we teach them, they are rote, they are systematic, there's an order to teaching them, and yet, in order to make them come alive for students, we have to find creative ways to present them. And so they can see the thing they've been staring at suddenly for the first time.
Chesterton is so good at that. Have you been able to sort of articulate what it is that makes him so good at that, or what can he teach us about helping to sort of give that crystallization in that moment, that epiphany, that aha about how things all come together in that complete vision?
Well, when I read Chesterton, I still have those aha moments. When I'm reading, I go, oh, I get that. I think when people read them, when they throw themselves at their mercy, which is when they throw themselves at his mercy, that's the only way you can read him, is let him lead you along. He'll take you on this journey to a place you don't expect. And that's again, the use of the imagination. That's how we teach. We find a new route to get to. There's only one destination to get to, and that's the truth. But we have to find the scenic route sometimes to get there.
Yeah, we were speaking ahead of time about this passage in Orthodoxy where he talks about how someone's really only convinced of something when everything sort of points to it. And we get this holistic vision of the world, and then we think we have this overwhelming evidence to convey to others, but it's so difficult to sort of hand over wholesale the entire imaginative vision of a particular thing. And he says, you get this impression that all roads lead to Rome, and yet that's why nobody ever gets there. How do we find that new and novel way to?
Yeah.
What does Chesterton teach us about that?
It's when you have this realization of the truth and you want to convey it. It's the great challenge is you want to try to explain everything all at once. It's as if someone has asked you, and Chesterton uses this example, defend civilization. Tell me, why is civilization better than savagery? And you don't even know where to begin. But then you look around and you say, well, there's that piano there, and there's that table there. And all of a sudden, you have all these examples of why civilization is better than savagery. And the same thing Chesterton says is possible in trying to convey the truth of Christianity. You can start with any object at all and find a way to get from that object to the ultimate truth, which is that God became man. There's always a way to get there.
In your teaching and teaching of Chesterton, have you found that there are certain objects that are better to begin with, or does it depend sort of on your audience?
Well, the great question that has been asked over and over again to me is, where do you start with Chesterton? And over the years, I keep changing my answer. It's, in fact, was one of the reasons I wrote some introductory books to Chesterton, because I thought those would be good doorways to Chesterton. But for the person who wants to read pure Chesterton, I always recommend you start with one of his essays. It's less of a commitment than picking up a book, or a Father Brown story, which is always a fun romp and will challenge your imagination as well as your expectations, because he just does everything a little different. But his essays are, in effect, mystery stories. They start out with a problem, and you're trying to solve the problem, and you get a few false clues, but are still very useful information. And you have all these great one-liners, as Chesterton's so strong with, and they can be completely distracting. You stop reading something from Chesterton because he's hit you with this thing you didn't expect. You underline it, you contemplate it, and when you start picking up, you don't know where you were. But finally, when you get to the conclusion, which is only in 1,200 words, you get to a conclusion that you didn't see coming, just like a good mystery story. It is solved in an unexpected way, and yet the whole time the truth was just staring at you, and you were staring at it, and you didn't recognize it until he does the reveal. Yeah.
You've got to have some humility, I think, when you're reading Chesterton.
Humility is good when you do anything, and I think that's one of Chesterton's great lessons. He's the best example of humility. Here's this gigantic intellect, this master of wit, and yet he's always self-deprecating. He never takes himself seriously, and he shows you how to be humble so you can appreciate everything else. He says humility is making yourself small so everything else looks bigger.
Yeah, can you say more about the role of wit and satire in his writing and his apologetics? And
Sure. Yeah, wit. Wit is a tool of logic, and it's a tool of self-defense, and we have to remember, wit doesn't convert anybody, but it is a way of fending off what could sometimes be a vicious attack on the truth. And Chesterton is the master of that. He's a great defender of the faith because he uses his wit so well. And it's disarming, it's knocking the sword out of someone else's hand with a good retort, right? And he does it in such a way that a combination of verbal twists. He's a master of the language. He takes the word and will do some word play, or a great logical turn on his opponent. And but the idea of humor is that it is also a humble thing, and if it's good humor, everybody should be able to laugh at it, including the person who's uttered the joke. He says it's an act of pride to not laugh at your own jokes. You should be enjoy the joke as much as anybody else. That's why he says, can't an architect pray in his own cathedral? So the idea of wit is the use of logic, and he makes a great comparison to the book of Nehemiah, where Nehemiah is rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, and his workmen have a sword in one hand and a trowel in the other. And this is a great analogy. He says the sword is the weapon of defense, and that's what wit is. That's what reason is. That's what logic is. And it's to defend the truth. But it's not going to convert anybody, and it's not going to build anything. The trowel is the creative tool, and that's the tool of love. And that's how we convert people, is with love. We can fight off the enemy with logic and wit, and make a good show of it too. but we're only going to convert them with the imagination, with creativity, with love.
If there were a work of Chesterton's that you were going to recommend to really show the trowel, what work would you recommend and why?
Well, for those who are familiar with Chesterton, my answer may sound boring and obvious, but Orthodoxy is such a marvelous book. It's because it's such a creative presentation of the Christian faith. It's funny that it's called Orthodoxy because it's such an unorthodox approach. Yeah, and you know, he starts out by defending what is the most sane view of the world, because all these other views are insane, and so he takes apart modern philosophy just by showing how it's insane. Insanity is not only the result of taking a bad logical idea to its natural conclusion, but also will lead to self-destruction. Every modern philosophy destroys itself, and you say, okay, this isn't what I was expecting. And then when he's really done, you know, that's the use of his wit and his sword. It's really quite a destructive work he does at the beginning of the book. Then comes the creative part, and he starts with fairy tales, and he gets us into the nursery. And he said, you know, the most basic truths that I learned were in the nursery, and I've never forgotten them. And they are the moral tales that have taken us along. You know, Jack the Giant Killer is this eternal lesson about courage. That you can't be brave unless you're afraid. Cinderella's about the humble shall be exalted. Beauty and the Beast is about loving a thing in order to make it lovable. And the lessons from Elfland, you know, carry over into the real world. In Elfland, they're imaginative, and we'll never forget them because of their magical qualities. But the reason and logic in them is exactly the same, and the moral is the same, and they are laying the groundwork for the fact that the Word became flesh. And then he just lays out all the reasons why Christianity is true and how it's attacked from all sides, and yet it seems to be the thing that is the answer for everything. And and then of course it ends with this image of Jesus that you don't read anywhere else in literature, about the one who's been hiding his sense of humor all along.
I think about that chapter a lot. I think in part because he leads you in a way where you feel like you can play the game, right? Some of the lessons of like Cinderella and Jack and the Beanstalk and Beauty and the Beast, you're like, yeah, I could see that lesson there. But then he's so perceptive, and I think about the lesson of like conditional happiness.
Right.
The first time I read that, I was just blown away. I was like, I don't think I ever could have seen that on my own. And it's at the core.
Mm-hmm.
It's at the core of the Christian story. It's
Yep.
at the very beginning. It's one of those things that was there and is foundational, but you've overlooked it.
Yep.
Has Chesterton helped you to see any of those overlooked lessons in the Christian imagined vision, the Catholic vision, either throughout the course of your life? Have there been any really essential things that have been really important for you that he's helped you see?
Well, I guess I'd have to start with the most obvious one. I mean, I grew up as a Baptist, right? And the last thing I ever thought in my life was that I'd become not only a Catholic, but someone who defended the Catholic faith. I mean, a lay evangelist of all things. And it was Chesterton that brought me to the Catholic Church, and he helped me see the Catholic Church for the first time, and I didn't even know that that's what he was doing. I found my objections to the Catholic Church dropping one by one, and he still hasn't even mentioned the Catholic Church in his writing. It's just that my whole mindset is being realigned by his writing as I find myself accepting a whole new view of the world.
Do you have any particular examples, if you don't mind?
Let's see. I mean, I started understanding the cult of the saints without him even mentioning the cult of the saints. That there are people who we talked about Francis, Saint Francis. He says, you know, you can't look directly at the sun, and yet you can look at the moon and see the light of the moon. He says, Francis is reflecting the light of Christ, and we can see the light of Christ when we look at Francis. He's like the moon, and he'll help us understand the light that only comes from Christ. And I said, oh, that's sort of how saints work. Yeah, I get that. Yeah. And then, of course, he gave me an incarnational or a sacramental understanding before I knew what the sacraments were, of how there's this physical presence of God in physical things that was not ever part of my theology. And there are holy places, there are holy things, and mankind has always understood that to be true. And that's why, that's why art is beautiful. That's why buildings are sacred, because that there is this physical presence to holiness.
I love his part where he talks about the intentionality of God's creation, and maybe he makes tulips the same way over and over and over again, not because he's bored with them, but because he's just so happy to see them the way that they are. It gives a kind of enchantment to the lives that we live.
And it's that childlike quality, because he says that the child will want things done over and over again until the adult is nearly dead, he says. But he says the child can thrill in monotony, and God is the only other one who can thrill in monotony to the same degree as the child. He keeps making the same daisy and the same sunset. Let's do it again. He says every night to the sun, do it again. Every night to the moon, do it again. And what a beautiful image. And Chesterton's own childlike sense of wonder comes out, and you start to realize, oh yeah, unless you become like a child, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven.
I want to ask more about that and his optimism, because Chesterton obviously reads widely, and he's reading a lot of contemporary things, and he finds them concerning. Why else would you write as much as he does if you didn't think there were plenty of things to write about and things to correct? And yet, he does have this kind of joyful optimism to him. What is that? Where does that come from? How does he understand Christian optimism?
Certainly Chesterton he's predicting a new dark age is coming, and he understands very well what happened during the previous dark ages. It ended, it ended in sexual, the civilization ended in sexual deviance, and ended with an attack on the family falling apart, and civilization itself crumbling because the family crumbled. And he realized the basic unit of society is the family. And he knew that was the only thing that was going to save civilization, is the family once again becoming the most important institution in the society. But he said during his lifetime, everything was attacking the family. No one was supporting the family. And we were watching the beginning of divorce being accepted, the beginning of contraception being accepted. He said it would lead to abortion, it would lead to sexual perversity, it would lead to the abuse of women. And he's saying this 60 years before Humanae Vitae. And yet, it's something I'll probably talk about tomorrow at Convocation. He has the prophet's hope. Prophets are not just people who condemn. They see what's going to happen, but they're offering a way out. We don't have to go down this road. This is where it's going to end, but let's get off this road and get on the right one, because repentance, we can turn it all around. And there's a distinction between optimism and hope. I mean, as Chesterton says in Orthodoxy, the optimist thinks that everything is right except the pessimist, and the pessimist thinks that everything is wrong except himself, right? But the optimist actually isn't really looking at things truly objectively. The Christian sees that there is dire trouble. There is definitely the work of the enemy very active in our lives and in our society. But the Christian can never lose hope. Hope is essential. Chesterton says we are not entitled to despair. And he says hope means hoping when things are hopeless, or it's no virtue at all. And Chesterton maintains the virtue of hope through all his writings, saying, there is a right way to act, there is a right outcome of the things that we're facing right now, and we can never lose sight of those things. I think his great strength is never despairing, and we are always tempted to do that. The worse things get.
What's the source of that strength for him, do you think?
Well, I think Chesterton, has a really a mystical relationship with Christ. I think that's the only way to explain it. I think that's why he writes about mysticism so well in his in his book on St. Francis of Assisi, when he explains Francis's mystical experience. You can even see it. He writes a book about William Blake, who is considered by many a type of mystic, and Chesterton can get inside Blake's head so well that you can say, okay, he's got it inroad here. But his mysticism is really a special vision that the true mystic is trying to reveal to everyone else. He's not trying to make things foggy or mysterious. He's actually trying to reveal a mystery. And I think Chesterton had this very close and profound connection to the divine. And that's why it seems like very little could shake him because of that. And as a result, we talked before about his great one-liners, how they're such showstoppers. Someone else once said, it's as if Chesterton reasons from the truth, while the rest of us are reasoning towards the truth. Every once in a while, we just get a little glimpse of this incredible understanding of the truth, that he'll just let one out to give us a little glimmer of light, and they're just so packed with truth.
Yeah, so Chesterton, clearly a lover of St. Thomas Aquinas, and you read, if you were to read them side by side, I don't think they could be more different. What's his relationship with St. Thomas Aquinas? How does Aquinas inform his writing? How do they depart?
Well, sure. What's so interesting is, of course, he has a lifelong relationship with St. Francis of Assisi. Long before his own conversion, Francis was an appealing figure to him. And this is such a universal saint that Francis appeals to many non-Catholics. And the first book he wrote after his conversion was his book on St. Francis. And then about 10 years later or so, he writes the book on Thomas Aquinas, which is the companion piece to the St. Francis book. In fact, it starts out by picturing these two saints who lived 100 years apart walking down a road together, and what they each represent in terms of the history of Christianity. And he says this one figure, that lean, ascetic, mystical figure, has taken the gospel to the streets. The other one, the more rotund and reflective and less wild-eyed figure, the scholar, has taken the gospel to the study. And they're both proclaiming really this, they're doing the same work, but one's doing it in the street, the other's doing it in the study, because what Thomas accomplishes is the high point of all Western philosophy, when he brings Aristotle into Christianity. He baptizes Aristotle. And what I see with G.K. Chesterton is this was Chesterton's own aha moment. He has this intuitive understanding of the truth, that is evident over many years. But when he encounters St. Thomas Aquinas, something happens to him, I think, a little bit, because it's a late discovery. And even though he claims that I haven't read any more of St. Thomas than of the Encyclopedia Britannica, he's read enough to have gleaned the essential truths of the great angelic doctor, and what he accomplishes is a wonderful, concise telling of the fact there is a truth. It's outside of ourselves. We can only encounter it through our senses, and our eyes and fingers and ears. Our five senses are windows to a world that is real, that we have not made up. And common sense says, yeah, we have to use our senses to encounter the truth that's outside of ourselves. That's just a huge insight, and he makes it. He makes it so beautifully in that book, and there is and is. There's your Chester line. There is and is, and we didn't make up existence. We encountered it, and so his quick analysis of Thomism is quite astonishing. But I think Chesterton had a wonderful encounter with himself, because this is as good as philosophy gets right here.
I want to tie that back into what we said earlier about the imagination as a kind of creative process. I think so often we think, creative as, ex nihilo, just out of nothing. And that can't be the case if we're continuing to, our educational journey, our encounter is discovering what's there. How do you pair this sort of discovering what is, and in some sense is static, with the creative aspect of the imagination? How do those two things fit together, especially within the course of our education?
Well, I think we alluded to it a little bit earlier that there is this truth. We're trying to explain it. We're always trying to find new ways to explain it. Because, as Chesterton says, you can stare at something 999 times, and in the 1000th time you see it for the first time. And the work of the creative artist is to find a new way to tell an old truth. And for the audience to suddenly see the thing they've been looking at for the first time. Goes back to the mystery story. You've been seeing the solutions. It's been sitting in front of you, and then when it's revealed, you go, oh, of course. Well, of course. But you were looking at the answer the whole time. So that's the connection between that stasis truth and the use of the creative imagination.
Well, I'm so grateful for your time today and for your presence here on campus, and hopefully this conversation will help others see Chesterton for the first time or see him again for the first time in a new way.
Well, it's great to be at the University of Mary. This is my first visit here, and I'm just so pleased with everything. And it's a great opportunity to meet with you, David. God bless.
Thank you so much.